green plains of Kansas in 1872, a woman named Julia Hessler was traveling by wagon. It had been a long day, and Julia wanted to stop at the inn to visit a certain spiritualist that was known for her special powers. When Julia stepped out of the coach, all she saw was a small, decrepit cabin. When she looked back, the coach that had dropped her off was already racing away. The self-proclaimed spiritualist Kate Bender would invite Julia into the cabin for their seance. Immediately upon entering the cabin, Julia would notice some strange things. A strong stench and flies buzzing about. But of course, she didn't want to be rude to her new host and decided to keep that to herself. And instead, she would sit down on the table across from Kate to begin their seance. But when she closed her eyes to begin the seance with Kate, all she could feel was utter doom. When she eventually opened her eyes, behind Kate, she saw 3 individuals standing there in complete silence, staring at her. John Bender, the patriarch of the family, was standing with something metallic in his hand. It was giving off a reflection in the candlelight, and it looked very much like a hammer. Upon seeing this, she was absolutely terrified and rushed out the front door. She tumbled out, but managed to get back on her feet and would spend the night running across the Kansas plain. This was just another day in the West. One wrong step, and it could be your last. The Wild West of the late 1800s has been a highly romanticized and glorified moment in history, one of pioneers, cowboys, outlaws, and Native Americans. This has been largely due to Hollywood. Movies with Clint Eastwood, where a lone, unknown hero comes into a town and saves the day all by themselves, or shows like Little House on the Prairie, where nice, friendly people live together, and through community and perseverance, they overcome all challenges. No matter the odds, they survive together on the frontier through their own willpower. Or other people like John Wayne, who no matter what, will overcome all obstacles through either his intelligence or his sheer will, or his skill with the gun. But you see, most people didn't live the lives in these movies. They wouldn't be as fortunate. For them, the Wild West was harsh, and it would be their grave. The frontier was a land of endless violence. One of the most chaotic regions in the United States during the late 1800s was Kansas. Before the American Civil War, Kansas had a civil war of their own between free staters and pro-slavery settlers. After the American Civil War, the violence of slavery was over, but a new violence would replace it very soon. During the 1860s, the United States would pass the Homestead Acts, which would encourage millions of settlers to head west. But this large settlement would eventually bring them into conflict with the Native Americans and with themselves. Outlaws roamed the highways, and the US Army battled the natives on the prairie. But there was also something else, a different type of violence, one that didn't occur on the grassy fields or on the roads. A type of violence that was more hidden and more diabolical. You see, there were serial killers on the prairie, dangerous ones. An unimportant and mostly unknown family of German immigrants had decided to settle in Labette County in Kansas. They operated their own inn, where they would give you a warm meal and a warm place to stay for the night. But for many, this would be the last meal you ever have. Beginning in the spring of 1871, people started to disappear around the Great Osage Trail in Labette County. Bodies would be found around the region, with their heads smashed in and their throats cut from ear to ear. In February of 1872, the bodies of 2 men were found with similar injuries. By 1873, these deaths and disappearances on this trail had become so common that rumors had abounded, and people started to actively avoid the area. It was very common to hear of these disappearances, and many people were fearful, believing that perhaps there was some sort of evil force, or maybe some sort of a gang or a group of Native Americans that were doing all these killings. However, despite this, some people still made the trek. They still faced the dangers. One of the men that would decide to make the journey across this dangerous area was a man by the name of George Newton Longcore. Recently widowed with an infant daughter named Mary Ann, he decided to leave his home in independent Kansas and resettle in Iowa to be closer to his parents. To make his journey, he would purchase a team of horses and a wagon from his neighbor, Dr. William York. In the early spring of 1873, with all his worldly possessions in his wagon and his young daughter by his side, he decided to depart. George would begin his journey to his new home in Iowa. However, he wouldn't make it to Iowa. Instead, like many before him, he would disappear on the wild prairie and leave no evidence behind. No one knew where he was or his ultimate fate. Eventually, his parents in Iowa would grow worried waiting for him, and they would send word back to Kansas, hoping to get some information about their missing son, to know where he is, and to make sure that he's safe. For their former neighbor, Dr. William York, this disappearance couldn't be a coincidence. George and his daughter were not the first people to disappear in this county, and they wouldn't be the last. They had joined many others in disappearing in the region. Too many disappearances were happening for all this to just be a simple coincidence. There had to be something behind this. Later on, William York would hear that the wagon and the team of horses that he had sold to George had actually been found abandoned. The horses were nearly starving, and the wagon still had the possessions of George and his daughter. In the March of 1873, William couldn't sit by by anymore. He had to know the truth behind what had happened to his former neighbor. He needed to make sure that they were safe, or at least know what their ultimate fate was. He knew that something was wrong, and he knew that his neighbor was in trouble, and he couldn't just sit by and do nothing. The Longcourts had lived by William for some time. William had gotten to know them, George, his daughter, and his recently departed wife. George had recently moved to Independence, hoping to settle a new piece of land that he had acquired, and start a new life for his family. They had been good neighbors, and he couldn't just ignore this disappearance, especially not of someone that he knew so personally. Something was wrong, and this disappearance couldn't be due to natural causes. The very scale of these disappearances, and the fact that so many of these bodies that were being found had similar injuries to them, there was some sort of a connection here, which meant that there was some sort of a central force, a central entity behind it all. William would begin his own journey to follow in the trail of George and his daughter. Perhaps he just wanted to find his old friend, or maybe he just wanted to save Marianne, or maybe he wanted to do it for the sake of their recently departed wife, but regardless, he would take the risk and make the journey. York would make his way over to Fort Scott, where the abandoned wagon had been found. Along the way, he would question every homesteader on the trail to see if any of them had seen George, to see if he could get any more information on his whereabouts. Along the way, he would learn about a certain family, the Bender family, a family of recent German immigrants that had arrived in the area just a few years ago. On Friday, March 28, 1873, he would finally arrive at Fort Scott. He would spend some time here, as one of his brothers, Ed York, was actually living in the area. A few days later, on Sunday, he would leave Fort Scott and start making his way back home. He had made it quite far, but unfortunately, he hadn't really found anything. Nothing conclusive. Perhaps he wanted to go back home and try again some other time. However, before heading home, he would decide to stop at the Bender Inn, an inn run by a family that he had recently heard of. We don't know why he did this. Did he suspect the Benders, or did he just need a place to spend the night? Regardless, he would go there, and he would visit the family. It is here that York would meet the Bender family and learn a certain dark truth, perhaps the truth that he didn't want to learn. But regardless, Bender would discover something. Upon arriving at the Bender residence, York would notice that their home was a little humble, maybe a little bit decrepit. The whole family lived in a one-room cabin. They had dug a small well and built a small crude stable. They even had a small garden with an apple orchard. The cabin itself was a little run down. It had a small sign out front that simply said groceries, with one door and a few windows. The Benders actually carried a few supplies, such as powder, shot, groceries, liquor, and tobacco, and they even sold some home-cooked meals to anyone who wanted them. They operated their business mainly as an inn, and provided a place to stay overnight for the weary traveler. It's unknown what York exactly would have felt at this time. The cabin would have certainly been off-putting. It may have even felt a little dreary, but maybe it wouldn't have been so off from most of the cabins in the area. This was rural Kansas after all in the 1800s. No one exactly would have had a well-built cabin. Settlers were often poor and had very little resources to work with. Did what they could with what they had. Many people lived in single-room cabins on the frontier. The conditions that most people lived in during that time might be considered third world by our standards, but back then, they were the norm. So perhaps by seeing this, maybe York wouldn't have been completely off-put. He probably would have just interpreted them as being a poor family, and even though it would have looked strange to us, it would have been normal to him. We still don't know exactly what he felt. Would he have noticed a strange feeling coming over him? Some dread pouring into his soul? Doesn't seem like it did, because he would decide to enter their cabin and meet the family. Upon entering the cabin, he certainly would have noticed the horrible stench and the flies buzzing about. Something tells me that this stench would have still been a little bit unique and definitely would have caught his attention, at least to some level. York, just like Julia before, probably wouldn't have mentioned this stench or made a big deal out of it. After all, he wouldn't want to insult his hosts. When he would enter the home, he would have noticed all four family members, as they usually tended to stick together and stay in their home. They were a small family of four, a normal looking family at first, but once you really got to know them, you would notice that each one of them has some strange quirks. You see, the Benders have been in the area for a while, and with many of the local residents, they had acquired a certain reputation that perhaps wasn't the most favorable to them. The true nature and origin of the Benders has been unknown for quite a while. No one truly knows where they're from, or even what their names were. It was believed at one point that they were all blood related, and they were immigrants from Germany. However, the German ancestry has been disputed for some of them. We'll go into the details a little bit later on. Contradictory information has come forth in the years since. Contradictory information about their names, origins, motives, and everything. In fact, it's even believed that they may have not even been a family, and most of them weren't even related to one another. Let's get into the family. Upon entering the cabin, the first person that probably would have caught the eyes of York would have been John Bender, the patriarch of the family. Or was it John Flickinger? No one really knows. He was a man that was known by many names. For our purposes, we'll simply call him John Bender. He was believed to be around 60 years old and spoke very little English. And what English he did speak was usually with a very heavy German accent, to the point where most people couldn't really understand him. One of the residents in the area would remark, John Bender was a repulsive, hideous brute, without a redeeming trait, dirty, profane, and ill-tempered. He stood over 6 feet tall and had piercing eyes, with a heavy beard. He was described as a giant of a man, and usually intimidated most of the people that were near him. John Bender himself was married to a woman who went by the name of Elvira Bender, though many had actually believed her to be born Elmira Mark. Regardless, we'll go by her name Elvira for our sake. She was described as being around 55 years old, and just like her husband, she spoke very little English, and what she did speak was with a heavy German accent, which made her just as incomprehensible as her husband. She, however, just like her husband, didn't exactly have the best reputation with the local residents. Many people in the local area considered her unfriendly and short-tempered, and she had been nicknamed the She-Devil. One of the residents had actually commented, "Old Mrs. Bender was a dirty old Dutch crone. Her face was a fit picture of a midnight hag that wove the spell murderous ambition about the soul of Macbeth." As you can see, there's 2 senior Benders, not exactly the most liked in the area. But they weren't alone. They had 2 children with them, John Jr. and Kate Bender. Or at least it was believed they were their children. Again, there are rumors that none of them were actually related to one another. His eldest child was John Bender, around 25 years old. Unlike his father, he was actually considered handsome and could speak English very well, with very little accent. Though he was known to laugh aimlessly, hysterically, with no end in sight. Many people considered him a madman, a half-wit because of this. The youngest of the Benders was Kate Bender. She was 23 years old, very well kept, and was known to be quite beautiful. She spoke English very fluently, with next to no accent. She was known to being very social and getting along with most of the guests that came to visit them in the cabin. This was quite contrary to most of her family, who tended to be very antisocial or very socially awkward. She was definitely one of the most interesting members of the Bender family, and also one of the most infamous, especially her reputation is to be believed. Kay herself claimed to be a healer and a psychic. She would advertise in the local community that she could cure illnesses and speak with the dead. She conducted seances and gave lectures on spiritualism. She also advocated for free love, which was essentially a type of proto-sexual revolution happening in the late 1800s. She also would give lectures to people in which she actually considered murder to not always be an evil act. She thought that it could actually be a dictation of good, and that in her personal world, what most people might consider villainy, she would read bravery, nobility, and humanity. She was against social regulations on sexual behavior, and confessed that she even had relations with her own brother. This would certainly raise many eyebrows, and make her somewhat of a social outcast in the local community. The whole family would be viewed with distrust and actively avoided by the local community. Of course, people that were coming out of town wouldn't always be privy to this knowledge, and many of them would visit the cabin to get supplies, maybe a place to stay, or a warm meal. And this is exactly how perhaps York might have ended up here. He might have heard their name, but maybe didn't know of their true deeds. Maybe to him, this was just a normal family, a place where he could rest on his way back home. It is possible that William might have mentioned George to the Benders to ask about his whereabouts. We don't exactly know what the Benders might have said back, but if they had anything to do with it, they may have claimed to have never seen him. Also, Kate might have actually offered to use her powers as she did for some other people to help him find George. When in the cabin, William probably would have realized that the cabin inside wasn't very much better than the outside. In many ways, it might have been worse. The whole cabin, like I said before, was technically one room. The Benders were using a canvas to split it in half. The back was the personal area where they slept and kept their possessions. The front was where they had the kitchen, the store, and everything else. The canvas itself was quite dirty and had quite strange stains on it. And that smell would have been awful. William certainly would have smelt it, as did Julia before him. But unlike Julia, William would stay. I think William would certainly realize that this homestead didn't smell like the others. The others might have had smells, but this smell was unique. While York would have been speaking with Kate, at this point, 2 male Benders would have gone behind the curtain. George probably didn't think too much of that. Perhaps he just thought they were going behind the cabins to go get something, or perhaps they were retiring for the day. At this point, I do wonder if William would have finally started to notice that something was wrong. Something about this place was strange. The stain on the canvas, the horrible smells. Heck, there were even bullet holes in the walls and the ceiling. But perhaps all this could be explained away. The stains could just be something that was spilled. The smell could just be really bad sanitation. And the bullet holes, well, those could have been caused by many different forces. Maybe someone was trying to attack their cabin. You never know. It was a wild place after all. But here's the thing. That smell, those stains, they could be from blood. You see, William was a doctor. He might have been familiar with these sort of things. He might have been able to identify the smell eventually. And there's bullet holes. Maybe they're not from the outside. Maybe they could have been from the inside. Maybe that blood was from those people. Maybe it was blood. But whose blood? Could it be that... No. Could they have tried to fight back? Could the Benders be... At that point, it all would have gone dark. On March 23rd, 1873 was the last time Dr. York was seen by anyone. At least alive, that is. You see, we don't exactly know what York's last moments were. Everything I told you so far is some bit of a dramatization. You see, everything I said so far is mostly based on facts that we know about other people. But I think it's fair to say that York probably would have gone out the way that I just described it. He joined many before him in disappearing. Just like George and his daughter, and many before, York had joined them in disappearing as well, going into the empty void of the prairie. But did George suffer the same fate the same way? Did he face the Benders as well? York would never truly find out if George went out this way, while he certainly would realize the Benders were trouble. But it was too late for him. He was gone, and someone else would have to pick up the mantle. It seems that William was exactly able to figure out the entire truth. He wasn't able to rescue his friend. In fact, he couldn't even rescue himself. Instead, William himself would become just another victim of the frontier violence. The victim of a depraved family. After this, the Benders most likely would have slit his throat from ear to ear to make sure that he was dead. He would have been robbed of any valuables, and he would have been buried in the garden by the cabin and the apple orchard. The Benders most likely would have seen York as an easy victim, someone that they could just kill and discard. No one would be the wiser. Someone that would be forgotten by others. Someone that people would just think was killed by the elements, or by natives or outlaws or some other group. But William York would end up not being just any other victim. You see, York wasn't a poor pioneer making his way across a dangerous frontier. No, you see, he came from quite an established family in Kansas. His family had resources. They had connections. One of his brothers, Alexander York, was a former colonel in the US Army from the Civil War and was currently a state senator in the Kansas Senate. And it would be this Alexander that would pick up the torch and begin his own hunt to figure out exactly what happened to his brother and also discover what happened to everybody else. You see, at this point, the Benders had outplayed their hand. They had killed many victims before, but this victim would end up causing them more trouble than he was worth. They would find themselves in a very difficult situation, and whether anyone liked it, the true horror would become known to everyone. As I mentioned before, many had gone missing around Lebec County. Most of them are usually small-time pioneers, moving around to settle the land, or just visiting family in the area. When they disappeared, it usually caused some panic and concern, but usually no major action from the community. People would eventually move on from it. Most of these people that disappeared were just regular Joes. They died, they perished, but so did many others on the frontier. But York, he was different. You see, he wasn't just an average Joe. He was a prestigious member of the community and well established in Independence, Kansas. And more importantly, he had two brothers that had both resources and connections to come after him, with more vigor and resources than what William himself had used. You see, William had decided to make the trek by himself, but his brother Alexander would bring a little bit more backup. These two brothers would eventually rally the whole community with them and become a huge manhunt for William. But who exactly was this brother? As I said before, his name was Alexander York. He was a veteran of the Civil War and a colonel, and many people actually referred to him as Colonel York. He was also a lawyer and a state senator in Kansas. He had another brother named Ed York, who actually lived in Fort Scott, and probably would have been the last person to see York besides the Benders. The two men, with their experience, resources, and connections, would end up proving to be quite the rivals for the Benders. You see, these two brothers were quite aware of William's travel plans. They knew where he was going and why he was going there. Colonel York himself would organize his own search with multiple volunteers and start following in the trail of his brother. They would search specifically around the area of Cherryvale, close to where York had been last seen in Lebec County. Alexander would follow in the footsteps of his brother William, and along the trail would question every homestead that he came across. But just like his brother before him, all trails would lead straight to the Benders. You see, Alexander had heard strange things about the Benders, and they would draw his curiosity. On March 28, 1873, Colonel York, with a group of armed men, would arrive at the Bender residence. He would speak with the Benders and question them about whether or not they had seen his brother. The Benders would actually admit that they had seen William, but would claim that he left and suggested that he may have met some trouble with local natives. Colonel York would actually accept this answer as reasonable, as in Kansas, there were a lot of conflicts with the local Native American groups, and it's very much possible that William may have gotten in their way, and violence may have occurred. At this point, Alexander would leave, continue his search somewhere else, but very soon, certain events would bring him right back. On April 3rd, a few days later, Alexander would hear a story of a woman fleeing the Bender residence after being threatened with a knife. Apparently, Mrs. Bender had gotten quite angry with her and had threatened to kill her. This time again, Colonel York would return to the property with armed men and confront the Benders again. His suspicions were risen, and he knew that there was something wrong with his family. In the beginning, Alexander would confront Mrs. Bender, but he couldn't exactly say much to her. Again, she did have a poor understanding of English and spoke with a very heavy accent. Eventually, the younger Benders would get involved and tried to make the claim that they actually never threatened anyone. That woman, she was simply hysterical. However, Mrs. Bender would eventually grow grow angry and become tired of the accusations. As I had said before, she had a very short temper. She would get quite angry and start yelling at the men, claiming that this woman was a witch and that she had cursed her coffee. What's interesting is that she said all these things in perfect English. Turns out that her understanding of the English language was far greater than what she had let on previously. She spoke with very little accent and sounded quite American. The situation was getting quite bad for the Benders, and Colonel York and his men were more suspicious than ever before. There was something strange behind this family, and they knew that they had to look more into it. At this point, Kate would start speaking directly to Alexander, hoping to use her sharp tongue to defuse the situation. She actually offered to use her psychic abilities to help him find his brother William, but she asked that he come back the following Friday and come alone. However, Alexander wasn't going to take this risk. I think we all know what they were planning to do when he came back alone. Of course, they wouldn't get the chance to do anything. At this point, the men with Bender were actually convinced that the Benders might be behind these disappearances. They had a history of violence, and they seemed like they could be capable of such things. But York wanted more evidence first, so he would actually leave the residence without any other incident. The Benders had managed to survive another day to keep their secrets hidden, but their luck would only continue to get worse. The recent disappearances had pushed the community to the edge. They had finally had enough. Unfortunately, the situation was getting quite unstable. Members of the community were starting to blame one another for the disappearances. Chaos was abounding. The Osage Township were called for a meeting to be held at the Harmony Grove Schoolhouse in order to address the situation. The meeting was attended by 75 people, including Colonel York, John Bender, and his son John Jr. At this meeting, they would discuss the disappearances and what exactly they were going to do to address the situation, because sitting by and doing nothing wasn't working anymore. At the meeting, they had decided that they were going to get search warrants and start searching every homestead in the area, from Big Hill Creek to Drum Creek. Many of the men in attendance would even volunteer to be searched first. That way, the suspicion on them would be gone. However, the two Benders that were at the meeting were quite quiet. They wouldn't say anything, hoping that their residence wouldn't be chosen first. After the meeting was concluded, people definitely felt a lot better afterwards, and now had a concrete plan and had some sort of a solution to address this problem. Many of them probably felt quite confident that they could solve the issue and find the truth behind the disappearances. There might have been a sense of hope at this time that the culprits might be caught and that justice may come to the slain, but the Benders weren't finished yet. Before the lawmen and the posse could arrive at their property, they would make their move. A few days after the meeting, a man by the name of Billy Toll was driving cattle by the Bender property. Once he came upon their land, he would notice that the cabin was deserted. You couldn't see any of the Benders inside. The animals looked unfed, and many of them seemed even near death. It was rare for all the Benders to be gone. Sure, the young Benders would leave from time to time, but the elders, they would always be in the home. Something was weird. Something was unusual. Billy, after he had seen this, would run to the township trustee, Leroy Dick, to report what he had seen. Leroy, upon hearing this, would immediately organize a group of volunteers and descend upon the property to see what was happening. The disappearance of the Benders had just made them the prime suspects in everyone's eyes. Unfortunately, it would actually be a few days before these volunteers would arrive, due to bad weather. I guess no one really wanted to go out there in the rain. But when they did arrive on the property, they would discover something that none of them would forget for their entire lives. A house of horror might be an understatement for what they really found there. They would have found a crude cabin, completely abandoned, a small stable with starving animals, and not much else. Upon entering the cabin, they found that most of the Bender possessions were long gone. Only a few items remained behind. This included 3 hammers, a knife, a clock, and a German Bible. The German Bible itself would actually contain some interesting and very cryptic and somewhat disturbing notes. Notes that give us some additional details about the Benders, and in some cases, create more questions. One of the notes would read, Johanna Bender, born July 30th, 1848. This would make Johanna around 25 years old in 1873, the same age as John Jr. Is it possible that this could actually be John Jr.? That this might be his real name? We don't know for sure, but that was what was contained in there. Another note would read, John Gibbhart came to America on July 1st, 18. Unfortunately, the last 2 numbers weren't readable. It is possible that this could be John Sr. Perhaps this is his real name, and this is when he came over to the country. Again, we don't have the full information. Perhaps he had decided to write down the date of his arrival. For him, it might have been important, but again, we don't know the exact year. But it does tell us what could be his real name though. Additional notes would read, Big Slaughter Day, Jan 8th, and Hell Departed. These last 2 notes are definitely the most discomforting and darkest. It seems that the Benders actually recorded some of their dark deeds, and even when they did them. Not 100% sure why they recorded this particular event. It talks about a big slaughter. Could this be when they killed the most amount of people in the shortest amount of time? It's quite disturbing to even think about it. Or perhaps these victims were the most important to the Benders. It's quite disturbing to think about what exactly could have happened on that day that would make the Benders write it down. But let's get back to the search party. Once it was confirmed that the Benders had fled the property, Leroy would call for more volunteers volunteers and asked them to come with pickaxes and shovels. When they entered the cabin, one of the first things that they noticed was the vile odor, the same odor that many before them had noticed as well. A horrible stench filled the whole cabin. It was something that most of them had never smelt before. They began to search for the source of the smell to see where it was coming from. Eventually, during this search, they would find a door, a trap door, behind the canvas, under one of the beds. The odor was as strong as near this door, and therefore, it caught most of their attention. The trap door itself was nailed shut, and would prove somewhat difficult to open. But once the nails had been removed, they would open the door, and find a hidden room under the cabin. At this point, they would realize that the smell was actually coming from under the door, from clotted blood that had dried. However, they wouldn't find any bodies hidden in this room. At this point, they weren't 100% sure where the blood was coming from. They would have to search a little bit more. The men in the search party would start to use their tools to rip apart the floor and start digging underneath the cabin to see if they could find anything. At one point, they would actually pick up the entire cabin and move it off to the side to make it easier to dig in the area. They didn't manage to dig across the entire floor, but actually found no bodies, no victims. Eventually, it was deduced that the smell was simply blood that had gone into the soil under the cabin, and that the source of the blood was somewhere completely different. They would start digging around the entire property, hoping to find some bodies, find the source of where that blood came from, and hopefully recover some of the victims. One of the things that they would notice is that the soil around the garden and the apple orchard was a little bit disturbed. It had been quite apparent that someone had been digging here recently. Upon digging in this garden, they would find the body of Dr. William York, the man whose disappearance really began a lot of this. He was found with his head smashed in and his throat cut from ear to ear, similar injuries to many others that had been found in the area. At this point, most of the men there would have been convinced that the Benders were behind all of this. Another 9 bodies would be discovered, buried around the entire property on that same exact day. Once daylight was gone, the men would rest for the day, but they would get back to work the next morning and find another 8 bodies. Another body was also found in the well, alongside some severed body parts from other victims. The vast majority of the bodies were found with their heads smashed in and their throats cut, all in a similar fashion. All the victims were killed in the same way, and it was believed that a hammer was used to smash their head in, and a knife being used to finish off the victim. However, they would find one body that didn't have these same injuries. It was the body of a young girl. She was found with injuries that were quite different from everybody else. It was deduced that her injuries were not the cause of her death, and that instead that she was killed by something else, strangulation, or being buried alive. It would later be known that this was the body of Mary Ann, the daughter of George, just another victim of the West, another victim of the cold frontier. George's body would also be found on the property. He had been killed the same way as everybody else. It seems that William York did find George and his daughter, just not in the way that he had hoped. Once the grisly site had been discovered, the news of all this would spread like fire. Journalists from as far as Chicago and New York would arrive in the area, with hundreds of onlookers coming to see this area. Souvenir hunters would descend on the property like locusts and rip everything apart, taking anything that wasn't nailed down. Actually, nails didn't even stop them. Eventually, the cabin, the stable, everything would be gone, taken by these souvenir hunters. At this point, even though bodies and other possessions had been found, the Benders themselves were still missing, still on the loose, and they were the ultimate prize. At this point, Alexander York would offer $1,000 for any information that would help them find the Benders, and the governor of Kansas, Thomas Osborne, would offer another $2,000. These amounts would be equal to $24,428 and $48,856 in 2023, respectively. The hunt for the Benders had begun, but the Benders would prove to be a little bit more resourceful than anticipated, and a little bit more tricky to find. They were an evil, but quick enemy. The Benders at this point had gotten a head start. They probably knew that they were going to come search their property, and they also probably knew that they wouldn't be able to move all the evidence, so they only had one option left, and that was to flee for their lives. The Benders would flee on a wagon with a team of horses. The detectives were able to follow the wagon tracks to a nearby Kansas town. Just outside the city limits of Thayer, detectives would find an abandoned wagon with a nearly starving team of horses. It seemed that the Benders had made it this far with the wagon and decided to change their transportation. The detectives would begin to search the entire city and eventually come upon a ticket clerk for the local trains. The clerk would tell them that he sold the tickets to a group of 4 to the city of Humboldt. These 4 individuals would be found to match the description of the Benders. Unfortunately for the detectives, this is actually where the trail would become quite cold, because on their way to Humboldt, they wouldn't stay there either. They would actually buy more train tickets and go to other areas. Unfortunately, at this point, they weren't exactly sure where they went. as there were many different options. The Humbles could have gone anywhere. They could have gone south to Texas, north to Kansas City. It was a little hard to follow all these tickets, considering the fact that many of the time, you didn't have to give your name. You could just buy a ticket, get on the train and go. So the records weren't exactly perfect. And also, they didn't have any actual photographs of the benders, just descriptions. And it could be quite hard to explain this to somebody and to ask if they had seen these people. There was a rumor that formed that the benders actually split up into two groups, with Kate and John Jr. going in one direction and the two senior members going in another. It's believed that John Jr. and Kate might have actually gone down to Texas, near the New Mexico border, and joined an outlaw colony. One of the detectives actually claimed to have tracked down John Jr. to the area, but apparently John Jr. had died of some sort of a disease. It is believed that Mr. and Mrs. Bender actually went in a completely different direction, to St. Louis, Missouri. In the coming years, many people tried to follow the Benders, but no one would actually find them. Many different groups claimed to have found them and even killed them, but none of them would ever present any evidence or even claim the prize money given out by Alexander and the governor of Kansas. There were even some people that were arrested for committing similar crimes, but none of them could be linked to the Benders. Their identities could not be connected. The story of the Benders would quickly spread throughout the entire country. Many people would claim to have seen them. Many people would have claimed to kill them, but of course, nothing could ever be confirmed. And the hunt for the Benders would continue for the next 50 years. One of the things that's interesting is that in 1884, there was actually an old man that was arrested in Montana, a man meeting the exact description of John Sr. Apparently, he had been arrested for murdering someone with a hammer, but unfortunately before someone could arrive to confirm his identity, he had tried to escape and would actually end up dying during this escape attempt, and his body would decompose significantly before any sort of ID could be made of him. Unfortunately at the end, the John Benders were never caught or punished for their crimes, but some of the people in the local area would actually be punished. Apparently some of the local residents had been helping the Benders hide the bodies, but again, the main source would never be punished, only their minions. Though the Benders were gone, never to really be seen again, their tale will live on, and their legend would shape the cultural landscape. Even the famous writer, Laura Ingalls Wilder, would write about the Benders in her Little House on the Prairie series. She would never mention the Benders by name, but she would talk about how her pa in Kansas had joined a group of vigilantes. Now, like I said before, we don't know the fate of the Benders, but I think it's fair to say that they're definitely dead now. So I wouldn't worry too much about them. You surely won't have to worry about the Benders coming for your throat. Not to say that if you ever do come across a decrepit cabin in the middle of the prairie, I would probably be worried, and would probably avoid that place if I was you. Even though we don't know the true fate of the Benders, we do have many records and an understanding of their activities while they stayed in Kansas. More than 10 bodies were found at the Bender residence, and it is believed that they may have been responsible for up to 20 different murders. To perform this act, what the Benders would do is that they would have their victims sit at the table at the front of the cabin with their back to the canvas. At this point, Kate, the most social, would distract them by getting them into a conversation or perhaps trying to show them her gifts. John Sr. or his son John Jr. would come upon the victim from behind with a hammer and hit him on the head, and one of the female members of the family would take a knife and cut their throat from ear to ear to confirm the kill. The body was then dropped in that trap door where it would be stripped of valuables and anything else of any use, and then the body would be buried somewhere on their property. It is quite interesting that they buried them all on their property. Was this due to foolishness, or were they really that full of themselves that they could go on doing this forever and never be caught? But why would they kill these people? I mean, some of their victims were wealthy, so they surely would have gotten some money out of it, but most of their victims were just normal people. They didn't really have a lot of money, a lot of resources. That has led some people to believe that they didn't just kill for personal gain. They may have been killing for the thrill of it. This would signify that the Benders weren't just opportunist killers. They might have been somewhat insane, and certainly depraved individuals. Now of course, not everyone who came into the residence died. There were actually many stories of people surviving, and many of these people would come forward after the discovery, tell people their tale. There was another man named William Pickering who would claim that he had actually come into the Bender residence at one point. He'd actually refused to sit by the canvas because of the stains on it. Kate, who's usually the most likable of the bunch, would become quite angry with him and start yelling at him, and even threaten him with a knife, and at this point, he would flee the residence. He managed to survive to tell the tale. There's another story of a Catholic priest who also stayed at the cabin. He noticed that one of the Bender men was concealing a hammer, and at this point, being frightened, decided to leave the area. A wise decision that certainly saved his life. Perhaps God had come in to save him. He would end up surviving because of this. And there was another case of two men who stayed at the residence to experience some of the psychic abilities of Kate. But once again, they also refused to sit at the table with their backs to the canvas. At this point, Kate would become abusive. The two other Bender men would appear from the other side of the canvas. The two men at this point would quickly lead the inn, another wise decision. You see, these men that I've just mentioned, they were the lucky ones. They managed to deduce that something was wrong just in time and escape before they lost their lives. But it does seem like there were other people also who had actually tried to fight to save themselves. Like I mentioned, there were bullet holes, more than a dozen in fact. It seems like it might have been possible that some people might have tried to use self-defense with their guns, but perhaps because they got hit in the head or overpowered, a lot of them weren't able to make it. In fact, most of them weren't. The damage to the brain may have simply been too much. It is here that many would fall on the Kansas plain and be buried on the Bender land. The Bender's garden and apple orchard would be nourished by the blood of their victims, but at least at the end, the Benders would threaten Kansas no more. It is quite sad to know that such evil exists upon us, and that such depraved individuals might be alive at this very moment. Perhaps even our own neighbors could be like this. The worst part is that the Benders most likely escaped earthly justice, but sometimes I like to think to myself that they didn't escape divine justice. William York lost his life, but his loss wasn't completely in vain. You know, I truly am inspired by his actions. Leaving his home, risking his life to find his neighbor, putting himself in risk, and ultimately losing his life for it. As the good book says, hath there no greater love than the one who will give his life for his friend. We should all hope that we have someone like this in our lives. Someone willing to risk their life for us. Though he didn't save George and his daughter, he didn't technically lose either. His sacrifice wasn't in vain. Because of him, the Benders would be discovered, and because of him, his brothers would eventually pick up the hunt and chase the Benders out of Kansas, saving many potential victims. And also, it doesn't seem like there was any other cases like this in any other part of the country. So it seems like wherever the Benders went, they probably didn't continue their activities. So again, many potential victims were saved because of the sacrifice of William York. Maybe for all we know, the Benders might have actually made an actual end for once. Regardless of what happened, the Benders left their mark on the frontier. You see, the Wild West was, well, a wild place. It was built on the bones and blood of countless men, women, and children. From the natives that were killed and pushed off their land, to the settlers that traveled across oceans to conquer it. Many people today possess a very romanticized version of the Wild West, one inspired by Hollywood and video games. Many people consider the Wild West to be this weird, idolized, simpler time. Some people might even consider it a better time. But in reality, it was a time of great violence. A time where every day was a challenge for survival. A challenge that many people would fail. The death brought forward by the Benders, ultimately, would be nothing but a drop in the bucket. From war to disease to the harsh weather, death was everywhere. But death that's caused by humans always seems to grab our attention the most, maybe because we expect more from our fellow man. Today, the Benders remain fresh in many people's minds. A real-life horror story that's so crazy that many people would believe that it's just a legend. And most likely wouldn't actually believe that it's real. But it was real, quite real, and that's the scariest part. When you think of the Wild West, don't just think of John Wayne or Charles Ingalls from Little House on the Prairie. Think of the Benders, a group worse than most. You see, the grassy fields in Kansas weren't sustained by water alone, but by the blood of fools, murderers, and a few good men. It required a tithe in which you gave some of your humanity, and the Benders certainly paid their fair share. Well, that's all I have for you today, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this story. If you managed to stick this long, I'd just like to thank you for sticking all the way. It's been about 3 weeks since I made my last video, and it's quite unfortunate. I've been trying to get the videos out a little bit more quicker, but with a full-time job and doing school part-time, it's hard to find the time to do this. If you enjoyed the video today, please like and subscribe, and leave a comment down below of what you'd like to see next, or what you thought about this video. I do think I'll have a little bit more free time this summer, so hopefully I'll be able to get more videos out every month. But again, can't really promise anything. Also, I'd like to thank you guys for the performance of the last video. At this point, it has almost 2,500 views, way more than anything I've had before. I'm not exactly sure what made it kick off, but I'm happy either way. You know, I started this channel back in February. I'd been thinking about doing YouTube for a very long time, but I finally actually got the confidence, and I'm very happy with what I've done. I'm very happy with what I've done, and I'm very happy that you guys come here to watch these videos. Anyways, that's all I have for today. Now, I gotta get to editing and hopefully get this out when I want it to, but I guess we'll see. Anyhow, you guys have a great day.